Oh, another traveler, lost among stars and dust, has found their way here, tired of battles, of cries, and of the world's heavy weight. Sit with me by the fire. Tonight, I shall tell you the story of Frieza, the one some call the Intergalactic Tyrant, a being shaped between worlds, who fell from the sky with a heart ablaze, walked among men with eyes turned toward the beyond, where even gods hesitate to tread. They say he came not as conquest, but as consequence, a silver star torn loose from its constellation, spinning through the cosmic dark until gravity claimed him. In those first moments of his earthward fall, witnesses spoke of how the very air seemed to hold its breath, how birds forgot their songs, and how the moon itself grew pale with wonder. Perhaps it happened this way. The universe, weary of its own vastness, sought to concentrate all its terrible beauty into a single form, and so it chose him, this being of porcelain skin and eyes like frozen flames, to carry the weight of infinite loneliness across worlds that would never truly know him. The old songs tell of his landing, not with thunder or destruction, but with the whispered sigh of settling snow, where his feet first touched the earth. They say flowers of impossible hues bloomed and withered in the same heartbeat, as if nature itself could not decide whether to welcome or mourn his arrival. He stood then, this child of distant suns, and surveyed a world that seemed too small to contain the galaxy that lived behind his gaze. The wind, curious as any creature, wound itself around his form and found him neither warm nor cold, but something else entirely, like touching the surface of a dream that had learned to breathe. In those early days, before legend grew thick around his name, he wandered the borderlands between civilization and wilderness. Shepherds would glimpse him on hilltops at dawn, a solitary figure silhouetted against the breaking sky, and speak later of how their sheep had grown restless, sensing something vast and unknowable had passed near their simple world. Children, with their innocent clarity, sometimes saw him clearest of all. They would point to empty spaces and whisper to their mothers about the sad, beautiful man who watched them from the shadows, who seemed to carry all the weight of starlight in his shoulders. But when the mothers looked, they saw only wind-bent grass and the ordinary magic of sunlight through leaves. The wise among those early witnesses understood that he was not truly of this world, though his feet made real impressions in the dust, and his shadow fell true at midday. He existed in the spaces between one breath and the next, between the ending of one song and the beginning of another, between the last light of evening and the first promise of night. Some still remember how he would stand at crossroads, not choosing a path, but simply being present at the place where choices lived. Travelers would approach from distant villages, and though they never spoke to him directly, they would later claim their journeys felt different, marked by a strange sense of purpose they could not name, as if invisible hands had blessed their roads with meaning. And in the deep places of the earth, ancient things stirred in recognition. The stones themselves seemed to remember older stories, older names, and would sing in frequencies only he could hear. For he was both beginning and ending, the first star and the last, carrying within his graceful form the paradox of power that served not itself, but something larger and more mysterious than conquest. The merchants and wanderers of that time would sometimes speak of encountering him at desert oases or mountain passes, always alone, always distant, like a mirage that had chosen to linger just long enough to remind them that the world held wonders beyond their imagining, and they would return to their homes, changed, though they could never quite explain how or why. Thus began the first chapter of his earthbound existence, not with the crash of arrival, but with the gentle unfurling of a presence that would haunt the margins of mortal understanding for generations to come, a silver shadow that reminded all who glimpsed him that there were depths to existence they had never dreamed to fathom. Perhaps it happened this way. In his wandering, he discovered a hidden valley where reality bent like light through water, where the very air held memories of what had been and whispers of what might yet come to pass. Here, in this place that existed between one moment and the next, he would retreat when the weight of watching became too great for even his eternal shoulders to bear. The valley held a garden unlike any other, not of growing things, but of surfaces that caught and held reflections of worlds beyond counting. Pools of mercury-still water reflected not the sky above, but distant nebulae where his true kindred dwelt. Mirrors of polished obsidian showed not his face, but the faces of those he had loved and lost across the vast emptiness of space and time. They say he would walk among these reflecting surfaces like a priest among altars, each one showing him a different aspect of the infinite loneliness that was his birthright. In one, he saw himself as he had been in the young days of the universe, when stars were still learning their names and worlds were soft as clay beneath the fingers of creation. In another, he glimpsed what he might become when the last light faded and only silence remained to remember the songs of existence. But it was in the deepest pool, the one that reflected neither light nor shadow, but something beyond both, that he would linger longest. For here he saw not himself, but those whose lives he touched in passing, the shepherd children who grew up to become healers, remembering dreams of a guardian angel who smelled of distant stars, the merchants who found courage in empty places, carrying with them the half-remembered comfort of not being alone, the warriors who laid down their swords, moved by visions of a peace too beautiful for battle to contain. In the garden's center grew a single tree, whose leaves were made of crystallized time. When the wind moved through its branches, each leaf would chime with the sound of moments that had mattered, a mother's lullaby, a lover's whispered promise, the last words of the dying who faced their ending with grace. He would sit beneath this tree and listen to the symphony of all the small eternities that mortals created in their brief dance with existence. Sometimes, on nights when the moon hid her face and the stars seemed closer to the earth, he would speak to the garden as if it could hear him. His voice, when it came, was like the sound of solar wind through the ribs of sleeping planets, carrying words and languages that had been old when the first consciousness sparked in the cosmic dark. "I have walked between the spaces," he would whisper to the listening air, "and seen how fragile is the thread that binds soul to soul. Yet in that fragility lies such strength as would humble gods." The mirrors would shimmer at his words, showing glimpses of the connections he spoke of, threads of light that linked every living thing in a web of understanding too complex for any single mind to grasp. And he would nod, recognizing in these visions the true nature of the power that flowed through him, not to dominate or destroy, but to witness and to guard the delicate miracle of consciousness reaching toward consciousness across the impossible vastness of being. The old stories say that sometimes, when the burden of his watching grew too heavy, tears would fall from his eyes like captured starlight. Where they touched the earth, new reflective surfaces would appear, small pools that showed not images but emotions made visible, joy like golden fire, sorrow like silver rain, love like the warm light that lives in the heart of every sun. And in these newest mirrors, those who came after him would sometimes catch glimpses of their own deepest truths reflected back at them, seeing themselves as he had seen them, not as separate beings struggling alone against the dark, but as notes in a vast symphony of existence, each one necessary, each one irreplaceable, each one held in the careful attention of someone who understood that to truly see another is the closest thing to prayer that consciousness can achieve. Thus, the garden grew around him, a sanctuary not of retreat, but of remembrance, where the one who had fallen from the stars could rest between his journeys and remember why the watching mattered, why the guarding was worth the loneliness it required, why love expressed as distance was sometimes the deepest love of all. In old songs, they remember how he learned to move between the spaces of visibility, becoming a presence felt rather than seen, not from desire to hide, but from understanding that some gifts are best given from the shadows, some guidance most powerful when it seems to arise from within rather than without. The warriors of that time spoke of him only in whispers, for he had become something more troubling than an enemy. He had become a conscience. They would ride to battle with certainty in their hearts and iron in their hands, only to find their conviction wavering like heat shimmer as they approached their goals, not because he stood against them with force, but because his very presence seemed to ask questions that had no comfortable answers. Perhaps it happened this way. A company of soldiers, hardened by years of campaigns, would make camp in some disputed valley. As the fire burned low and the sentries dozed, he would come among them like a walking dream, not to harm or threaten, but simply to be present as they slept, his awareness touching theirs with the gentleness of moonlight on still water. And in their dreams, these warriors would find themselves in strange landscapes where their swords became too heavy to lift, where their enemies revealed faces beloved and familiar, where every victory turned to ash the moment it was won. They would wake with tears on their cheeks and questions in their hearts, speaking to each other in hushed tones of dreams that felt more real than the waking world. Some among them would lay down their weapons then, unable to explain why, knowing only that the fire that had driven them to war had been replaced by something else, a longing for home they had forgotten they possessed, a memory of purposes larger than conquest. They would walk away from the battles that had defined them, becoming instead gardeners, teachers, keepers of orphaned children. But it was not only warriors he touched with his shadow dance, the merchants who hoarded grain while the hungry wandered past their doors would find their sleep filled with visions of abundance shared, of wealth that multiplied when divided rather than diminished. The rulers who built their thrones on the bent backs of their subjects would dream of power redefined, not as dominion over others, but as service to the mystery that connected all things. They say he had learned to read the language written in the spaces between heartbeats, the secret scripture inscribed in the pause between question and answer. He could see the places where souls had grown cold, where fear had built walls so high that love could no longer find a way in. And to these frozen places, he brought the warmth of his attention, not to melt the walls by force, but to remind the ice that it too was once water, once flowing, once free. The children were first to sense the change he brought. They would play in market squares and suddenly grow still, turning their faces toward corners where nothing visible dwelt, smiling at emptiness with the recognition that innocence grants to truth. Their games would shift, becoming gentler, more inclusive, as if invisible hands had shown them new ways to find joy that did not require another's sorrow. He walks among us, the wise women would murmur as they ground their grain and tended their fires, the one who remembers what we were before we learned to forget. And though they could not point to him or name his location, they felt his presence in the way their bread rose higher, the way their children laughed longer, the way their husbands came home with softer eyes and hands that reached for embrace before ale. There were those who tried to hunt him, of course, warriors and bounty seekers who heard the whispered tales and thought to make themselves famous by capturing the shadow dancer. But how does one trap a reflection? How does one cage the space between one thought and the next? They would track footprints that led nowhere, follow rumors that dissolved like morning mist, spend their lives chasing something that was always just beyond the next hill, the next valley, the next turn of the road. And perhaps that too was part of his gift, to give the hunters something eternal to pursue, a quest that would keep them moving, keep them searching, keep them alive, with purpose, long after bitterness might have claimed their hearts. For in the hunting, they too were changed, becoming something more than they had been when they first took up the trail. Thus, he danced through those years, a presence that transformed without touching, that healed without medicine, that taught without words, a shadow that proved light existed by its very existence, silence that made all other sounds more precious by contrast, a loneliness so complete it somehow connected everything it touched to everything else, weaving the world together with threads of silver light that only the heart could see. Some still remember how he became the keeper of lost things, not objects or treasures, but the forgotten pieces of souls that break away in times of great sorrow or fear. In the deep hours of night, when pain grew too large for any heart to contain, fragments of the wounded would drift free like sparks from a dying fire, and it was he who gathered them with infinite tenderness, holding them safe until the soul that had lost them was ready to heal. Perhaps it happened this way. A mother, weeping over the grave of her child, would feel a part of herself scatter on the wind, the part that had known how to hope, how to believe in tomorrow's grace. And though she could not see him, he would be there in the gathering dusk, cupping this escaped piece of her in his careful hands, whispering to it in the language of stars, promising it that night does not last forever, that dawn has always returned, that love is stronger than the spaces death creates between one heart and another. They say he carried these fragments in a place that existed beyond his physical form, a sanctuary woven from starlight and patience, where the lost parts of broken souls could rest and remember their wholeness. Here, the warrior's forgotten capacity for gentleness lived alongside the tyrant's abandoned dreams of justice, the thief's discarded honesty beside the saint's surrendered doubts. The old women who midwifed the dying would sometimes speak of sensing his presence in sick rooms, not as harbinger of death, but as guardian of what would remain. They learned to recognize the signs, the way the air would grow thick with silver silence, the way the dying person's face would suddenly smooth with an inexplicable peace, as if invisible hands had lifted some unbearable weight from their spirit. Something watches over the last moments, they would whisper to those who came after, something that ensures no soul departs incomplete, that all the scattered pieces find their way home before the final breath. And though they could not name what they sensed, they knew it was benevolent, this presence that moved through their sacred work like a blessing too deep for words. Children orphaned by war or plague would sometimes wake from nightmares to find their rooms filled with an unaccountable warmth, as if summer itself had visited in the dead of winter. They could not see their comforter, but they felt him there, a presence vast as sky, yet gentle as their mother's vanished lullabies. In the morning, they would rise changed, carrying within them a certainty that they were not alone, that someone unseen held vigil over their dreaming and would catch them if they fell. The broken-hearted, wandering in their wilderness of loss, would find themselves drawn to certain places, hilltops where the wind carried impossible comfort, groves where the trees seemed to whisper secrets of endurance, springs where the water, tasted of tears, transformed to blessing. And though they never saw him clearly, they would feel the touch of his understanding, the recognition of one who had known sorrows that made their own seem small, yet who had not let bitterness take root in the garden of his compassion. There were nights when the moon herself seemed to lean closer to the earth, and on these nights, those with the sight would glimpse him more clearly, a figure of silver radiance moving through the world's dark places, gathering up the fragments of shattered hope, the pieces of trust that trauma had broken, the scattered remnants of faith that despair had torn asunder. His hands would glow with collected starlight as he worked, weaving the lost pieces back together with threads of patience, infinite as time itself. The madmen and the dreamers, those whose minds had wandered too far from ordinary shores, often spoke of him with perfect clarity. The one who remembers our forgotten selves, they would say, their eyes bright with visions others could not share. He keeps the parts of us we think are lost forever, polishes them clean in the spaces between stars, and returns them when we're strong enough to be whole again. And perhaps that was the deepest magic of his keeping, not just to preserve what was lost, but to restore it transformed. The grief he gathered returned as wisdom, the fear as compassion, the anger as strength, refined by understanding. Those who encountered him in their darkest hours would find, sometimes years later, that qualities they thought destroyed had bloomed again within them, returned not as they were, but as they were meant to become. Thus he walked the borderlands between breaking and healing, a shepherd of scattered souls, gathering up what others could not see they had lost, and holding it safe in the infinite patience of his watching, a keeper of the pieces that matter most, not the ones that make us strong or successful or admired, but the ones that make us human, fragile, capable of touching another's pain with recognition and responding with the only power that truly matters, the choice to care anyway, to love despite the certain knowledge that love makes us vulnerable to loss. In the deepest years of his wandering, they say he learned to speak the language that exists in the spaces between words, the tongue of silence that carries more meaning than all the libraries of the world combined. It was then that he became not just a presence, but a teacher, though his lessons were given not through speech, but through the profound eloquence of simply being present. Perhaps it happened this way. A scholar, bent over ancient texts and driven to madness by the weight of all the knowledge he could not contain, would suddenly find his study filled with a silence so complete it seemed to have texture, depth, dimensions that ordinary quiet could never possess. And in that silence, the scholar would understand that wisdom was not in the accumulation of facts, but in the spaces between them where mystery lived and thrived, and offered its gifts to those humble enough to stop demanding answers. The monks and mystics of distant monasteries would speak of visitations that came not as visions, but as absences, moments when all the seeking and striving that drove their spiritual practice would simply cease, replaced by a presence that asked nothing, demanded nothing, required nothing, but the willingness to sit in the vast emptiness that contained everything. They would emerge from these encounters transformed, their prayers simpler, their service deeper, their understanding that true knowledge begins with the acknowledgement of how little can ever truly be known. Musicians found their art changed by his invisible teachings. The greatest among them would lay aside their instruments during performances, feeling compelled to create space for something beyond sound to express itself through the assembled listeners. In these moments of musical silence, audiences would weep without knowing why, feeling their hearts touched by melodies that played in registers too deep for ears to hear. He teaches us to listen, the master musicians would explain to their students, not just to sound, but to the spaces that give sound meaning. Every note exists because of the silence that surrounds it. Every song is really a dance between presence and absence, and he shows us how to honor both partners equally. The lovers, especially, were touched by his teaching. Those whose passion had grown loud with need and want would find themselves drawn to quieter embraces, discovering that the deepest intimacy lived not in the words they spoke to each other, but in the wordless recognition that passed between them when all pretense fell away. They learned to make love with their presence itself, to touch each other's souls through the simple act of paying attention. Children, as always, were his most receptive students. They would gather in circles during their play and suddenly fall silent, not from command or instruction, but from some shared understanding that in the quiet, something beautiful was happening. Adults who witnessed these moments would feel their own childhood stir within them, remembering when they too had known how to be present without purpose, how to exist without agenda, how to simply be alive without needing it to mean anything more than the miracle it already was. The gardens he had once walked began to reflect his teaching. Plants grew in patterns that spoke of spaces as well as substance, creating compositions where emptiness was as deliberately placed as any flower. Visitors to these gardens would find themselves slowing, breathing deeper, discovering that beauty could exist not just in what was there, but in what was deliberately left absent. Even the animals seemed to understand his lesson. Forest creatures would gather in clearings and simply rest together, predator and prey sharing the same peaceful space, their ancient enmities suspended in favor of something larger than survival. Hunters who stumbled upon these gatherings would find their weapons growing heavy in their hands, their hearts opening to wonder at the sight of wolf and deer drinking from the same stream, acknowledging each other not as threat and target, but as fellow travelers in the mystery of existence. The dying, perhaps more than anyone, became fluent in his language of silence. Hospice keepers would observe how the presence they could never quite see would settle around deathbeds like a benediction, and how the departing would suddenly stop their struggling, their labored breathing, easing into a rhythm that matched something vast and peaceful beyond the reach of pain. In those final moments, families would later swear they felt him there, not as death, but as the silence that makes death simply another note in the endless song of being. And perhaps this was the gift he offered through his wordless teaching, the understanding that silence is not empty, but full, not absent, but present in a way that transcends presence itself, that in learning to be quiet, truly quiet, one discovers the conversation that has been going on forever between soul and universe, the dialogue that needs no words because it is written in the very structure of existence itself. Thus he moved through the world as a master of the unspoken truth, teaching by example that the deepest communications happen in the spaces between breaths, that love speaks most clearly when it has no need to speak at all, that wisdom consists not in having answers, but in learning to live gracefully within the beautiful, terrible, endlessly generative power of the question itself. They say that in the twilight years of his earthbound journey, he began to gather the threads of light that connected all living things, not the visible light that illuminates objects, but the deeper radiance that flows between consciousness and consciousness, the luminous web that proves no soul is ever truly separate from the whole. Perhaps it happened this way. Standing at the peak of a mountain that touched the belly of the sky, he would extend his awareness like gentle fingers, feeling for the golden strands that linked every beating heart to every other. Where he found darkness, places where souls had forgotten their connection to the greater light, he would weave new threads, bridges of starfire, that carried love across the voids that suffering had carved between one being and another. The wise ones who studied the patterns of human behavior began to notice changes that defied explanation. Ancient feuds would suddenly dissolve, not through negotiation or conquest, but through a mysterious softening of hearts that no one could account for. Enemies would meet across battle lines and find themselves unable to remember why they had ever thought violence necessary. The weapons would fall from their hands like autumn leaves, and they would stand staring at each other with the bewildered recognition of sleepers awakening from a shared nightmare. Children born during this time were different, marked by an unusual capacity for compassion that seemed to flow from them like light from a candle. They would reach out to comfort strangers before they had learned to speak, would weep when others felt pain, even if they could not understand its source, would laugh with a joy so infectious that it spread through communities like beneficial plague, healing divisions that had festered for generations. The net is being rewoven, the grandmothers would whisper as they watched these children play. Someone is mending the great web that holds all souls together. The breaks that cruelty made are being sealed with a silver thread. Merchants traveling the trade routes reported encounters with fellow travelers who seemed to carry more than goods in their wagon. They carried hope itself, infectious as song, spreading from caravan to caravan until entire cities found themselves lifted into states of inexplicable optimism. These merchants could not describe what they had seen or heard that changed them, only that after certain chance meetings on the certain roads, the world looked different, felt different, as if it had been touched by hands that remembered its original beauty. The artists and poets of that time found their work transformed by visions they could not explain. Painters discovered their brushes guided by inspirations that came from beyond their conscious minds, creating masterpieces that seemed to glow with inner light. Writers found words flowing from their pens that spoke truths they did not know they knew, stories that healed hearts they had never met, poems that built bridges between souls they would never encounter. We are channels, they would tell each other in their gatherings. Something flows through us, something that knows what the world needs to hear. We are not creating these works. We are simply allowing them to manifest through our hands, our voices, our willingness to serve beauty rather than ego. The healers noticed it too, the way their patients' bodies seemed to remember wholeness more easily, the way old wounds would suddenly close, as if time itself had reversed its course. They spoke in hushed tones of a presence they felt during their most difficult cases, invisible hands that seemed to assist their own, wisdom that whispered guidance in languages they felt rather than heard. But perhaps the most profound change was in the quality of human attention itself. People began to truly see each other for the first time in generations. The veils of prejudice and assumption grew thin, allowing souls to recognize souls across every boundary that had ever been used to divide them. Rich and poor, old and young, native and foreign, all these distinctions remained, but somehow they no longer carried the weight of separation they once had. Lovers found their bonds deepened by connections that transcended the physical, sensing each other's emotions across vast distances, sharing dreams that were more real than waking experience. Parents discovered they could comfort their children with their presence alone, their love flowing through space to touch small hearts that were afraid in the dark. Friends, separated by circumstance, found their affection undimmed by distance, held together by threads of light that neither time nor space could sever. And in the places where he walked most often, the crossroads and hilltops, the desert springs and forest clearings, the very air began to shimmer with accumulated blessings. Travelers would stop without knowing why, feeling compelled to rest in these spots, emerging from their brief pauses, changed in ways they could not name, but carried with them, like seeds that would bloom in their later years. Thus the great work continued, invisible and patient as growth itself. The web of light that connected all things grew stronger, brighter, more resilient, until even those who had never heard his name could feel its presence, could sense themselves held in a vast network of care that extended beyond anything they had ever imagined possible. In the final season of his wandering, they say he created a place that existed between memory and prophecy, a garden where every footstep that had ever been taken and every step that would ever be taken existed simultaneously, where past and future embraced like lovers who had been separated by the illusion of time, but never truly apart. Perhaps it happened this way. In a valley that seemed ordinary to casual observation, he began to plant seeds that were not seeds but crystallized moments, fragments of pure experience that would grow into trees whose fruits were understanding, whose shade offered rest, not just to weary bodies, but to souls exhausted by the weight of their own becoming. The first to discover this garden were those who had lost their way completely, not just geographically, but spiritually, emotionally, existentially. They would stumble into the valley by accident, or what seemed like accident, drawn by compulsions they could not name toward a destination they had not chosen. And once there, they would find themselves able to rest for the first time since their lostness began. The trees in this garden bore strange fruit, not apples or oranges, but crystallized emotions that glowed with inner light. The fruit of forgiveness hung ruby red and warm, healing hearts that had grown cold with resentment. The golden fruits of wonder restored the capacity for amazement to those who had forgotten how to be surprised by beauty. The silver fruits of acceptance taught the art of embracing what cannot be changed while still working toward what can be transformed. Children who found their way to the garden would play games that seemed to bend the laws of cause and effect. They would chase butterflies that were also memories, their laughter releasing clouds of luminous seeds that would drift on the wind to plant themselves in the hearts of those who needed most to remember joy. Their games were prayers, their play a form of worship that required no god but the celebration of existence itself. The artists came too, drawn by dreams of a place where inspiration lived like water in a well, inexhaustible and pure. They would sit beneath the trees and create works that seemed to paint themselves, write themselves, sing themselves into being. These masterpieces carried within them the power to transform all who encountered them, becoming seeds of beauty that would bloom in galleries and concert halls and libraries throughout the world. In this place, the artists would whisper to each other, "We remember what art is for, not to make us famous or wealthy or important, but to be vessels for the sacred, translators of the mystery that surrounds us, bridges between what is and what could be." The lovers found the garden to be a sanctuary where their deepest truths could be spoken without fear. Couples who had grown distant would arrive separately, drawn by the same mysterious calling, and find each other again beneath trees that had been grown from their own best intention. The garden seemed to remember what they had been to each other before disappointment and habit had dimmed their vision, reflecting back to them the love that had brought them together, polished clean of all the dust that daily life had allowed to settle upon it. Even the dying made pilgrimage to this place, though none could say exactly how they found it or why they felt compelled to come. Here, in the shade of trees that grew from crystallized moments of grace, they would spend their final days in a peace that surpassed understanding. Death in the garden was not an ending, but a transformation, like stepping from one room into another, carrying with them all the love they had ever given or received. The garden grew not just in space, but in time, becoming more itself with each passing season. What had begun as a small grove expanded until it seemed to encompass everything, not through conquest, but through recognition. Visitors would return to their ordinary lives, only to discover that the garden had somehow followed them, that its peace and beauty were now visible in places they had never noticed before, in the way light fell through their kitchen windows, in the sound of their children's breathing, in the ordinary miracle of water flowing from a well. And at the center of this expanding sanctuary, where all the paths converged, stood a fountain that played not with water, but with liquid light. Those who drank from it found their memories cleansed of bitterness, while their hopes were refined of illusion. They would rise from the fountain's edge, understanding that every step they had ever taken had been leading them to this moment of recognition, that home was not a place, but a way of being present to the gift of existence itself. Some say that he too would come to drink from this fountain, this one who had wandered so far from his own home among the stars. And in those moments of his communion with the liquid light, the garden would pulse with such radiance that travelers passing miles away would stop and turn their faces toward its hidden location, feeling their hearts lift with inexplicable hope, sensing that somewhere in the world a great work of healing was being completed, that the broken places were being made whole again, one crystallized moment of grace at a time. Thus the garden grew, becoming not just a place, but a possibility, a reminder that even in a world marked by separation and sorrow, someone was always working to plant seeds of connection, to tend the growing places where souls could remember their kinship with each other and with the vast, mysterious, endlessly generous intelligence that had dreamed them all into being. And so came the time of his departing, not with fanfare or announcement, but with the gradual thinning that marks all endings that are also transformation. Those with the sight began to notice that his presence, while still felt, carried a quality of distance, as if he were already halfway between the world of form and the realm of pure possibility from whence he had come. Perhaps it happened this way. On a night when the aurora danced with unusual brilliance across the sky, he stood once more at the crossroads where his earthbound journey had begun. The garden he had tended for so long stretched around him, no longer confined to a single valley, but spread throughout the world like veins of light running beneath the surface of ordinary reality. His work was not finished, could never truly be finished, while consciousness sought consciousness across the vast spaces of existence. But it had reached a completion, a fullness that could sustain itself. The children sensed his departure first, as they had sensed his presence most clearly. They would pause in their play and look toward horizons that seemed suddenly emptier, their games taking on a quality of gentle melancholy, as if they were saying goodbye to a friend they could not see but had always known was there. Their mothers, watching, would feel their own hearts grow heavy with a loss they could not name. The artists found their inspiration changing, becoming less direct gift and more remembered blessing. The words still came, the visions still bloomed, but now they carried the quality of echo rather than immediate presence. Their works became monuments to something that had passed through their lives like a season of grace, leaving them forever changed, but no longer dependent on its constant flow. In the places where he had walked most often, the air began to shimmer with accumulated memory. Travelers would stop at these spots and feel themselves touched by visions of what the world could become, glimpses of a future where the threads of light he had woven would grow strong enough to hold all of creation in a web of conscious compassion. These visions sustained them through the difficult years that followed, when the memory of his presence had to serve in place of his immediate care. The wise ones understood that his departure was not abandonment, but graduation, that what he had come to teach had been learned well enough by enough souls to continue without his direct guidance. The seeds he had planted in human hearts were growing, sending out their own tendrils of connection, creating their own gardens of grace in places he had never walked, but his influence had reached. On the final night of his time among them, those with the deepest sight gathered, without summons, at the places that had been most touched by his presence. They came not to witness his departure, but to offer their gratitude, to sing the songs of farewell that honor those who have given of themselves beyond measure. And though they could not see him clearly, they felt his attention upon them, warm as sunlight, vast as sky, tender as the last touch of a beloved hand. As dawn approached, the aurora grew brighter, no longer confined to the polar regions, but spreading across the entire sky in waves of silver and gold and deep celestial blue. And in that light, those who watched saw him as he truly was, not the wandering figure of legend, but the conscious flame that had worn flesh like a garment, the star-born intelligence that had taken upon itself the weight of caring for a world not its own. He rose then, not through movement, but through becoming, his form dissolving into the aurora itself, until there was no distinction between the watcher and the light, between the guardian and the beauty he had spent so long protecting. The sky pulsed once with brightness beyond imagining, and then settled into the ordinary colors of morning, leaving only the memory of radiance to mark what had transpired. But his departure was not truly an ending. In the years that followed, children would still sometimes pause in their play to smile at empty corners. Lovers would still find their hearts touched by presences they could not name. The lost would still discover paths through darkness they had not known existed. The dying would still find peace settling around them, like a blessing carried on wings too swift to see, for what he had been could not be contained by any single form, and what he had given could not be taken back by even his own leaving. He had woven himself so deeply into the fabric of the world's becoming that every act of kindness carried an echo of his presence. Every moment of recognition between soul and soul continued his work of connection. The garden remained, though it wore now the appearance of ordinary landscape to those who looked with ordinary eyes, but to those who had learned to see as he had taught them to see. It was everywhere, in every sunrise that painted hope across the sky, in every child's laughter that reminded the world how to be young, in every gesture of love that proved the impossible distances between hearts could always be crossed. And if someday, upon closing your eyes, you hear a breath rising from the void between the stars, perhaps he is still out there, guarding the dreams that dared to touch the infinite.